Hello and welcome to another lighting diagram lesson. My name is Trenton Hoshiko, and today we're talking about the famous painting Whistler's Mother by Whistler. Who would have thought? Before we get started, if you want to get my Filmmaker Tools template for Draw.io, that includes all of these tools up here, you can head over to my Patreon. I have a link down in the video's description to the exact post and download that tool set for free. Draw.io itself is an open source and free diagramming software. If you want to learn how to use those assets, get them imported, import your own images, all those kinds of things, I have a video from a while back that I've also linked down in the video's description that is my kind of get started guide. While you're on my Patreon, if you want to support lighting diagrams like this one and the whole series that I've done, as well as my regular cinematography videos, you can join as a supporter for as little as $2. If you want to join for free, I'm happy to have you as well. I'm trying to get my total number of members and supporters to about 100. That's my next goal. So if you want to go support me in that, I would really, really appreciate it. Now, this is a painting that's always been pretty interesting to me because it's very simple in a way. You know, it showcases Whistler's mother, but she's kind of cold. You know, it's his profile view, and it's very, very flat. And so I thought that would be something that would be interesting to talk about here, is how we can use flatness. Because generally the rule is for cinematography and photography, don't have your light right behind the camera or right in line with the camera as your primary source, because it makes your images flat. But part of understanding rules for image making is also understanding how you can break them to use them for your own style. I think that this is very interesting because it kind of, to me, comes off as this sort of cold disposition. I don't know anything about Whistler's life or Whistler's mother's life, but it is interesting how that then, you know, is read by the audience. In my research of this painting, the other thing that's really, you know, drawing people to it is the use of color tones. And I think it's interesting is there's pretty simplistic color tones here that, you know, very effectively and almost photorealistically in some ways render Whistler's mother sitting for a portrait. So let's talk about some of the lighting in this image. Basically, what I first notice here is that there's this ever so slight shadow right behind her back and right in front of her. It's ever so slight. It's not even like as big as that. It's basically in line with her. It's like you put a drop shadow on her almost. It does go slightly downwards, but when I say slight, I mean slightly. And you can see under the chair a similar thing kind of happening. This image is very soft and delicate, and at the same time has this accuracy to it that I am just always impressed by. The lace here is translucent. You can see the color through, as well as her skin tone just a little bit. When we're talking about the face itself, it's so even. Everything in this painting is very evenly lit. We have the blacks, we have the whites, and we have these grays that are probably just a little bit over middle gray, but, you know, depending on exactly where you're looking, here's probably a little over, here's probably about middle gray. And thus we have the entire range of the light to dark spectrum represented here, and also all of it falls kind of exactly where it should be, with no lighting aspect that is really highlighting anything in particular. Everything's flat. It's a little like almost clinical, except for that softness also. And all the colors in that are represented, I think, very neutrally. Like I said, we have kind of a black, white, and gray. We do have a little bit of a blues and a little bit of a tanny yellow, but by and large, everything here are pretty neutral colors. There's nothing incredibly saturated here, let's say. So when we look at this, though, we don't see any fall off happening over on, you know, this side, let's say. We don't have the light falling off here and, you know, getting darker right there. We do have a little bit of darker nature up here, but seeing that's in line with her face, I don't actually think that that's darker. I think that it's like the cloth itself is dingier, essentially. We don't have any, you know, vignetting or anything like that. Everything about this painting is very even and very flat. So then how do we do that and have it look proper? Well, the thing about this is that this is sort of improper in a way. This is very, very different than like a chiaroscuro or something like that that has this like intense contrast to it that is dramatic in the lighting and shafts of light, or Baroque or a Dutch master that uses the lighting to have all this shape to it. There's almost the opposite here. We have very little lighting shape. Everything is just so even and still and stable and consistent throughout. And, so it's interesting that it has this like stability aspect that you feel. So let's talk about how we could actually build this. Now, it's not that difficult. The idea here is understanding what you're doing with it and having that be how you actually do it, because, through your understanding. Because if you just did this, like as a student filmmaker, and you didn't know what you were doing, you just put a light there and you did it, without any reasoning, just because you weren't thinking of the lighting anymore, it probably would look pretty, for lack of better terms, cheap or amateur. At the same time, when you know what you're doing with this and you're using it for a reason and you're using it very specifically, that's when, artistry comes out a little bit more. And so, we've all seen short films, especially student films, where you have the couch and the couch is pushed up against the wall and you put the camera, right in front of the two people that are sitting on the couch talking to each other, and you put the light right behind the camera because you're learning. And that's what you do. And maybe it's not exactly, straight on to them, but it's just slightly off to the side or whatever. And ultimately, that shot is very flat. And for the most part, it won't look as good as what you could get out of, shooting, singles and then having a master that's the two shot, but having the two shot be slightly off angle or something like that, or just a little bit wider and showing the room, having the perspective be facing down and not just, flat against the wall in terms of what your, perspective from your lens is. I'm not saying that that is inherently wrong or inherently bad, but could you get more out of it in some cases? Yes, but at the same time, would this be the same shot if it was a really contrasty, looking into the camera portrait? I don't think so. I think there is intention here, and I think that the profile aspect is, very, very interesting to me. And something that's important to also note here is that this painting was originally called Arrangements in Gray and Black. That's kind of the focus here. This is a study for Whistler. His mother is just kind of the vehicle for the study. And I do think that that is part of why it feels a little bit cold, because he's viewing the whiteness of his mother's bonnet and the blackness of her outfit. She is kind of in this, more of a funeral garb, it kind of looks like, in my opinion, and this gray wall. And he has all these tones and they're all separated, even if they're really close to each other, tonally. And I think that's part of it is his mother isn't really the portrait here. And like I said, it wouldn't be the same painting if this was a, she's looking directly at the artist, and then therefore the audience with a contrasty face and shafts of light or something like that. It wouldn't be the same thing because that's not what he was doing. That would be a more traditional portrait. That'd be like, yes, I've painted a portrait of my mom. Here is I painted a portrait of my mom with this whole design aspect to it that is the driving force for it, and the portrait itself is almost a vehicle for it. I have seen comparisons with this to still lifes because of its kind of feeling. It is almost lifeless in a way. And I think that is very interesting. And you can kind of see a lot of the elements of, still life compositions in something like this with, instead of it being apples in a bowl and a cloth that's draped, here we have various cloths that are draped and a footstool and this wall and then this person, but none of them are the individual focus. The whole collection of them is the focus. And so I think that the lighting here is what kind of seals the deal. By having it be this very even, flat tone across everything, we get these tones to be very consistent. We get the black, we get the gray, and we get the white, and then all the shades and, kind of slight deviations towards blue or tan in between. And if it wasn't so flat, then those tones wouldn't be the focus of this image in the way that they are. And so if you are looking to make tones very, very consistent, a flatter lighting style could be right for you. And so, like I always talk about, these are all the choices that we make for how we are deciding to light our films or photography. So now with that understanding in place, let's build this out. So we're going to have just a little set wall here. This is either on location or on a set. It doesn't really matter in my opinion. This can be done basically anywhere because we're just looking to have very, very flat light done very intentionally. Okay, purple chair. And she's a little bit away from the wall, but not super far. You can just see a slight gap there. And if you kind of look at how far the feet are apart on the chair, you know, she's pretty right up against the wall. So we're just going to put her right about there. And we do want to make sure that we have some sort of curtain-like thing, because that is a kind of an important part of this design. And the thing that's always kind of interesting to me is her feet on the stool. Her legs are slightly extended, almost in a slightly uncanny way, in my opinion. Her knee seems to be too high, or maybe she's, I guess she couldn't be crossing her legs because both her feet there. It just is kind of interesting to me, and it provides just this really dark shape in the middle of your frame, but yet you're still getting these folds. Like if you really zoom in here, we're still getting tonal variation here. This is more of this like golden kind of black, and this, and sort of a brownish, and this is, you can see all these folds right here. And so we want to be able to get that, and that's, part of how this lighting is going to work. This would also be very dependent on the types of fabrics and materials used. So you would obviously probably have to work with costuming if you're really trying to replicate this image in particular. So she's sitting there, and then we basically just have the wall, and we have these paintings on the wall, and they're part of this composition too as well, because this is kind of this grayish tone here. It's almost like a sepia tone, and it's probably a drawing. I don't know if that's a Whistler drawing or if she's separately an art enthusiast. It doesn't necessarily matter in particular, but having these aspects to it are all just elements that are brought together to show off the artist's design and tone, rather than a traditional portrait. And so this is basically our setup. It's pretty simple. Now, to accentuate the flatness of this, I would say you would want to shoot this with a normal type lens. And so let's place our camera. We're going to be back just a little bit. It's not anything too far away, nor too egregiously close. The normal lens will help reduce distortion. We don't want to have any sort of like fisheyeing effects. And we also don't want to have the space be too compressed. We do get the sense that there is some space between these objects, her and the wall, for example, but it's still quite flat. And so we're not going too far past a normal lens to accentuate that further. Now, you obviously could, and this shot would look very different if you had more physical space separation, type look with a wider lens. But we're just going to try to replicate it as it is. So I'm saying this is a normal lens, probably somewhere around, 50 to 70 millimeters. And so we'll be here, and we'll just be a little bit further back, and we're going to make that composition. So now we have a couple different choices. The bigger the light here, the better you're going to be off for getting it to be incredibly even. That is the focus. We want to fill this entire frame before it has any fall off. So I would say, so I'm going to go in here, and I'm just going to say this is resizable, and we're going to make this roughly a 12 by 12, and we're going to put it right behind the camera. And with this right behind the camera, now anything that's in front of the camera is going to be having this huge light source on it. A 12 by 12 is very large. I think we sometimes don't appreciate exactly how large a 12 by 12 is. And so we'll do something like this. And that would get us this type of look. We don't see the other end of this, so I'm going to just reframe this slightly. So something like that. To light a 12 by 12, you do need a huge amount of light. You definitely would need either a huge open face or several other lamp heads depending on what you're using, and you would need them to be pretty powerful because of the diffusion itself absorbing some of that light, and also the distance between the diffusion and our subject. We would definitely need a good amount of light going into this. A large open face in this way would be a really good option. This is a pretty expensive way to do this. This might be the easiest way, just the most, concise. You can set this up, very traditional film equipment, but let's talk about how to do something like this on a budget. So instead of using a 12 by 12, I'm going to go back down to either a 6 by 6 or a 4 by 4, whatever you have access to. And we're still going to push a huge amount of light through this. I'm still going to use 2 lamps. You can definitely fill that frame and get this kind of light. Now this is smaller, so we're going to have to bring it in a little bit closer like this to get the right spread. Otherwise, the setup is pretty similar. We have a diffusion frame, either a 6 by 6 or a 4 by 4, and we are filling that entirely with a lot of light. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, but the camera's right in front of it, so wouldn't that be causing shadows on the wall or the floor or somewhere around here? And the answer is no. And the answer is no because that light going around it is being so diffused that we are not getting a shadow by the time the light is hitting her. Now, when we're looking at her, we see that little tiny bit of a shadow right there. That's all we're getting from her being right next to the wall because that light is wrapping around her so much. Now, if you want to get something a little bit more, you could also do something like this where you have 2 of these frames right next to each other and either doubling up or quadrupling lamps, but you probably could do it as such with 1 frame on the left, 1 frame on the right, 1 lamp on the left, 1 lamp on the right, and have a similar effect. We just want something large. Now, this diffusion source could also be something like the core of a 5-in-1 reflector. That's totally possible and reasonable as well to get a large diffusion source. I talk about using those all the time as a replacement for, having a larger, more complex 6 by 6 setup. So something like this could work as well. But let's talk even cheaper here. If nothing else, we could just use 1 4 by 4 diffusion or 1 core of a, large 5-in-1 reflector and 1 lamp. That is definitely possible. That would be significantly cheaper still. What would also be possible is if we wanted to do this with an octabox instead. Now, with an octabox, you would probably need to be closer, so maybe your lens would need to be just a little bit wider. So, we're making some concessions here, but the octabox could absolutely do this as long as you're not letting it fall off because of its round shape on the left side or the right side or the top corners or the bottom or having any roundness to it. We want it to be very even. And in that way, maybe a very large softbox would be better, but these kinds of options run you in the $50 to $100 range. The diffusion, if it's a 5-in-1 reflector diffusion, these 3 options are definitely smaller. The 5-in-1 reflector diffusion will be the biggest of all of them, but they run you in a kind of $40 to $100 range generally. This would be slightly more effective probably because you're using 2 lamps. Even if you're just using a 5-in-1 reflector diffusion here and having it be the size of 2 4 by 4s, if you have 2 lamps, it will just give you that much more light to work with and that much more spread across it. You won't have to get as close. And here is your easiest setup. You could also do this if you had great timing with something like a window and an overcast day. If you have a large bank of windows back here behind the camera and they're bringing in enough light, then you could get a look like this. Although I think that would be a little bit more difficult to time, but it's technically a possibility as well. There we have it, 3 different ways to light something like Whistler's Mother to get this type of really flat lighting. Remember here, the main focus is making sure that that shadow is directly behind her and incredibly soft. If this was a harder shadow, I think everything would look just really kind of muddy and you would have these harsher angles to it. Even if it was flat but hard light, I don't think it would work the same. We want soft and we want flat. And to get that, you want to have the biggest source that you have possible and the most light you can have going through it. Our aperture here, we're also going to not have it be, some sort of shallow depth of field look. We want to have the details and the sharpness of the painting back here and the curtain, and also, the edge of the floor at the front, as well as all the detail of her. So yeah, we're not looking at a 2.8 or something here. I would shoot this at probably a 5.6 to an 8, somewhere in that range. We're not that far away, and she's not that far from the wall, but just something to really maximize the sharpness of your lens that you're using. And so yeah, like I said, this is a relatively easy setup. The reasons we do it and knowing why and how are the more complex things here. If you're not more experienced with actually lighting things, or your story doesn't have something that really calls for this kind of, even tones, or, more of a cold disposition type thing, I would suggest not trying to incorporate this kind of thing into your cinematography or photography lighting, right away. If you have something that calls for it, obviously, that's the rule always, right? We are lighting to tell our stories. Here, the story is about the artist's interpretation of the light and the tones rather than his mother. But in that, his mother working with him, his choice to use her as a sitter, all those things are a story in of themselves. And I think this is a very beautiful painting. And while it looks simple, it takes a lot of skill to get something like this in a painted medium and as well in a photographic medium. So if you like this lighting diagram, please give me a like down below. It really helps me reach other people who also like lighting diagram and cinematography and photography discussions like this one. I'm really trying to grow my channel. I just crossed 1,000 subscribers. I'm really excited about that. And I'm now reaching upwards for 2,000. As I said at the beginning, if you want to get my cinematography tools template, that's available on my Patreon. That's patreon.com/Trenton Hoshiko, and that direct link is down in the video's description. While you're there, you can also join as a free or paid member. Both of those do really support this channel and these videos. The paid memberships start at just $2, and you get to vote on upcoming videos and lighting diagrams. Thank you to everybody who's already gone over there and joined. I really appreciate every single one of you. So thank you so much for watching. And this week, go out there and try to be kind to somebody. There's a lot of things going on in the world, and we just all have to be as kind to each other as we possibly can. It really makes a difference in everybody's lives, including your own. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful week ahead of you.